Hey there, my name is Alex. I am the Silvermont. This is going to be a unusual video compared to what I usually do, one that I really struggled to come up with a catchy name for. In essence though, it is born from my experience with the Midir fight in Dark Souls 3's DLC. It got me thinking, why don't I like this boss? Because, spoilers, I don't like it. Why do other people like it? What makes a boss fun or memorable? And what do we look for in particular in a Dark Souls boss, and video game bosses in general? As I'm sure you're well aware, one of the reasons Dark Souls became so notorious was because of its bosses. Even if you take any element of challenge away, they are still quite often the highlights of the game, with atmospheric arenas, impressive designs, and one of the few times the games will bring in the soundtrack. All for the most part without having any scripted elements and very few cutscenes or dialogue. But then we have Dark Eater Midir. I don't like this boss at all. Now, I'm not going to try and convince you to hate it or anything like that. I fully understand why people might enjoy the boss, and I'm not even going to attempt to change your mind. But personally, I just find Midir very interesting because when I compare him to earlier bosses in the franchise, I feel like he really sums up what I personally dislike. And again, if you like Midir, that's absolutely fine. But here are the main reasons I just don't like him. First up, I think Midir has way too much health. There are two parts to this. In general, I'm not a fan of extremely long boss fights. Sure, they exist in many JRPGs, and I'm used to them. That doesn't mean I enjoy them. When you're in a raid and watching the boss's health go down a tiny tick per minute, the idea is that you are fighting something so incredible, so powerful, that only the combined power of 20, 40 adventurers, each of them alone forced to be reckoned with on their own, can eventually defeat it. I get that. And it also works, phases and mechanics. But in reality, what it comes down to is repetition to the point of boredom. That is, again, why raid mechanics exist. They help mix it up there with different phases and so forth, and breakpoints and all that good stuff. But even then, you run into the risk of people just looping their actions over and over between phase transitions and the like. Dark Souls almost never has mechanics in place for boss fights. They all boil down to the same sort of tactic for the most part. Sure, one boss might be weak to fire or piercing or whatever, but for the most part it's dodge, block, counter. There's nothing wrong with that, by the way. That's just how the fights are in an action game. So when we fight Midir, he has a health pool so large that the only person who can match it would be Yorm, and that's because Yorm does in fact have a mechanic in that you're intended to use the Storm Ruler to remove the advantage of his giant health pool. Of course you can fight Yorm without it if you want. Midir though, it's just an endurance slog, made all the more frustrating by the boss constantly changing location, which means you have to jog or sprint after him. I actually raised a similar complaint against Sin from Dark Souls 2. He's constantly jumping about the arena or flying around, meaning you spend half the battle running after him like an incompetent little buffoon. But Sin's health pool wasn't quite as ludicrous. If you ask me, the best Dark Souls boss fights are between 2 to 3 minutes in length on average. Shorter, intense boss fights, in my opinion, better suit Dark Souls and its themes. If this were Anime Fighter Extreme Destiny, then it makes sense that we're going to be fighting some guy for 5 hours whilst the planet explodes around us. But has it not always been part of Dark Souls' very nature that things end abruptly and violently? Doesn't Dark Souls 2 have an achievement, a trophy called like Welcome to Dark Souls when you first die? And Demon Souls starts off with you being forced to die. I mean, you beat the Vanguard and then abruptly the Dragon God punches you in the head. So I just feel these shorter, more explosive, violent fights work better. With a whimper, not a shout. And no, this has nothing to do with difficulty. I think a great example once again is Ninja Gaiden 2. The bosses in that game are brutal, but you can tear their health bar in huge chunks at a time. And in essence, I think Midir has so much health that he becomes tedious rather than exciting. And fighting a giant abyss dragon should not be tedious. Then there's, well, I just straight up find Midir a boring fight. Here is an ancient dragon ostensibly raised by the gods who's been consuming fragments of the abyss, and we'll get more into that later. And he's one of the last bosses in Dark Souls 3, a game full of bosses who have second or third phases where dramatic things happen. You'll notice I don't apply the too much health fights take too long concept to Gale. And that's because Gale has 3 distinct phases. He's the final boss of the entire franchise, and it's also broken up with a neat cutscene. Midir has a second phase, but nothing effectively changes. He gets 1-2 new attacks, but nothing about the fight actually changes. Just off the top of my head, wouldn't it have been really damn cool if at 50% health, Midir exploded, all of the abyss energy inside him becoming too much for him to bear, and it just explodes, making him look like some sort of weird manus-gaping dragon thing. Instead, he just sort of crouches over and farts at us. And whilst Midir visually looks cool, there's just nothing exciting about him to me. Calamite has his magic eye gimmick on you, where he tries to make your head explode with that horrible noise. Sin had that really damn cool looking poison fire. But Midir, he just reminds me of the ancient dragon from Dark Souls 2, before they nerfed it. Annoying, a boss I never want to fight. It's one of those bosses I go, oh, do I have to? I guess. Finally, there's the lore implications of Midir. Yeah, it's From's world and it's their story to tell, but most of the Ring City's implications were stupid to me. I don't like the idea that the gods can just raise a dragon. Why would they? From what we knew of their relationship with dragons in the first game, it seems completely unbelievable to me that they would just start trying to use one for their own purposes.
The dragons shall never be forgotten. We knights fought valiantly, but for every one of them, we lost 70 of our own. Exhilaration, pride, hatred, rage. The dragons teased out our dearest emotions.
It kind of loses the impact when you add on, yeah, but we're also going to use Midir as a vacuum cleaner for the Abyss. I also don't like knowing that dragons can succumb to the Abyss. It makes them seem less special and the Abyss too much like some sort of fan fiction that's being power wanked endlessly. Back in Dark Souls, the dragons were some mysterious, immortal entity that we knew virtually nothing about. Now and then we would come across fragments of them, destroyed but still moving, because they never really seemed to be alive in the first place, so they couldn't die, they were just destroyed. And we even encountered the stone dragon of Ash Lake, eerily serene and divine. Now in Dark Souls 3 we know that they had dragon pets, and the Abyss can overcome them just because. What is the Abyss? Essentially it's the humanity of Manus that raged out of control. It makes virtually no sense that it would have any realistic impact on a dragon. Being poison to humans, gods, sure, it makes sense. They have souls. But now apparently dragons have souls too. Why? Just because we wanted to give them boss souls so that you can get weapons from them. Gone are the suggested soulless, immortal titans that were unlike any life form we could understand, replaced with essentially generic fantasy dragons. I know this is a highly subjective complaint that is, I assume, unique to me, but it really ruined a lot of what made the dragons in Dark Souls so interesting to me in the first place. The relationship between man, god and dragon. But now, no, it's not really all that impressive at the end of the day. They were just random fantasy dragons that can be killed by basically anything you throw at them. It's all good. So Midir is a disappointment to me from a lore and a gameplay perspective. He sums up a lot of what I don't like about Dark Souls 3, retconning or changing things from Dark Souls 1 that didn't need to be changed or explained. There were things in Dark Souls 1 that needed to be changed and explained because it's not a perfect game. It's a great game, sure, but the PvP was stupid. Backstabbing as a gameplay mechanic was fundamentally broken. So yeah, there were things that needed changing, but we didn't need to know this much about the dragons. We don't need boss fights that last like 5 or 6 minutes. Ugh. My favourite part about Midir is the mini-boss fight we have with him on the bridge. But don't get me wrong, he looks cool, and the visuals in his boss fight can be amazing at times, with all those purple particles dancing in the air whilst we appear to be fighting in the caverns from the Dark Souls 1 intro. They just needed to cut his health in half or by a quarter and give him a proper second phase. And that's ignoring the fact that most monster giant fights in Dark Souls essentially revolve around us smacking them in the toe. But what do you think? I know I'm in a minority when it comes to Midir, and as mentioned, it doesn't annoy me or anything that people love him as a boss fight. I'm not trying to change anyone's mind. It's just an interesting subject to me, thinking on what makes a Dark Souls boss fun or interesting. Why do people like this boss? Why do people hate this boss? But to some extent, I think most people hate Bed of Chaos, whereas a lot of people like Artorias as fights. And there are definitely things you can pin down that make a boss fight more sort of universally enjoyable. But I came to realise that my favourite fights in the franchise are always against humans, because I think that's how the Dark Souls combat mechanics work best, against enemies similar to yourself. Against giant enemies, as mentioned, you're basically just smacking them in the toe, and the camera is too close, and it's no Dragon's Dogma, let's be honest. So perhaps that's one reason I didn't mind Dark Souls 2 having so many night bosses. I know that is a common complaint in Dark Souls 2. Oh, 90% of the bosses are just a guy in armor or whatever. But what other games have stupid or amazing bosses? Dragon's Dogma has my favourite monster bosses out of any game, because they feel like they have a sense of scale. You can climb on them, strike their weak points. Incidentally, I love the giant beholder fight in Dragon's Dogma. Everything about that fight is just super fun to me. Another thing Dragon's Dogma does right, when you get the boss into a critical state, for example, when you down the griffin that's been flying around, the music changes to, not the victory theme, but the, now it's time to kick some ass theme, you know? It's great, I love it. Metal Gear Rising does the same sort of thing. But when it comes to mechanically rich boss encounters, I actually feel Destiny did this fairly well. For all its flaws, of which there are many, and they are profound, I think Destiny married FPS shooter and raid mechanics extremely well. And it was really satisfying once our group began to move like a well-oiled machine and get all these mechanics done. As mentioned, Metal Gear Rising is a game that centres on boss fights. I love the way they had the boss's theme kick into gear during Phase 2. The theme starts off with no lyrics, but then when something dramatic happens, when shit gets real, when shit hits the fan, the lyrics kick in. I think it really adds a lot to, the fight. I also have to mention Ninja Gaiden, as I love the boss fights in that game. And of course, I have to mention Final Fantasy XIV. The game has mechanically rich bosses, along with Metal Gear Rising's amazing musical transitions during phases, quite often the same way as Metal Gear Rising, from non-lyrical to lyrical, and there's probably some of that playing in the background right now. Once again, what do you think? What is the longest boss fight you've been through? Were you one of those people who fought Absolute Virtue for 12 hours straight? I hope not, but that would be interesting. Either way, thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you guys next time. And if you'd like to support my channel and get access to an exclusive Discord chat server thing, check out the Patreon links in the description. Ciao. Incidentally, I've been playing Final Fantasy XII lately, and I hear that has a really insanely long boss fight in it. That would be fun.